Alright, I gotta do a quick plug before the video starts. So, if you like this video in particular, you can go to my other channel, Hydra, the best Hydra. That's at the best Hydra. I do game streams. I plan on doing gameplay slash readings similar to this, but with like books and whatnot. I've been wanting to do this particular video for like multiple years at this point. Finally, this Halloween, I'm doing it. I'm doing a compilation of all my favorite classic creepypastas. I was a little bit sick while recording it, so please take that in mind. If you have any suggestions or criticism, let me know in the comment section. But other than that, I guess it's time to get straight into classic creepypastas right now. Right now. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State, and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. A Suicide Note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It's not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice, and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever awake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and a loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Lenny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. A journal entry translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They're hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice. Unintelligible text. A Mariner's Log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again. At the request of the rake. From a witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after having a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the bathroom. I used this moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the bed until it was less than a foot away from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, or probably closer to 5. It just seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway, leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it, crouching and hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the rake." My husband drove his car into the lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got into contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages and never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed. This still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the rake. I can't even listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head makes me very upset. I've not seen the rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept, and I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. I'm a researcher of the paranormal, a claim you've no doubt heard innumerable times. In truth, I don't care if you believe me or not on that matter, as we all have our own beliefs. I know what is real, and I think you're all intelligent enough to decide for yourselves whether or not I'm genuine. What I'm about to share with you is a story of an entity known as Mr. Odd, who I've been tracking for several years now, receiving many emails and letters as well as the occasional phone call or visit from people who have claimed to have encountered the creature in some form or other. The earliest account of Mr. Odd appears to have been in 1969, where a group of friends camping out claimed to have been woken one night to a horrific sight: a bald man's head attached to an impossibly long neck, literally slithering its way into their tent like a blasphemous snake. The campers panicked, but almost as soon as the creature appeared, it retreated into the night. The following day, the shocked campers packed their things and headed back to the city. After this, several other campers in the area claimed to have similar encounters. One even claimed the creature took a large chunk from his left leg, which showed signs of being mauled, though doctors dismissed it as a bear or other wild animal. Eventually reports died away, and now the phenomena is reported only very rarely, though many campers still claim to experience strange feelings of dread in the area, as if being watched by an unknown force. Starting in 1986, the Mr. Odd phenomena took a decidedly darker path as people in the city began to tell stories of being attacked at night by a bald man's head attached to an impossibly long neck, victims never seeing any other part of the creature's body. Many also claim the creature is gigantic in size, though some claim it's only slightly bigger than a human. The city-based attacks were decidedly more violent than those of the late 60s and early 70s, with people often blaming Mr. Odd for the disappearance of family pets or children. In one particularly disturbing case, a man convicted of killing his entire family claimed they were devoured by a monster that was described as being very similar to the creature known as Mr. Odd. At the height of these city attacks, a small group of vigilante-style hunters scoured the streets, and after several nights claimed to have fatally wounded the creature, though they were unable to track down its body. Mr. Odd remained inactive until the late 1990s, when new reports came, this time taking another impossible twist. People claimed that they were being attacked by a supernatural being capable of emerging from television sets, computer screens, or even in one case, from under a victim's bed. Again, reports were of a bald man's head attached to an impossibly long neck, the rest of the creature's body unable to be seen, if it was even there at all. Now, I don't know if these recent reports are the result of overactive imagination, mass hysteria, or a clever hoax, but I do know for certain that the Mr. Odd phenomenon is by no means over. If you happen to be a researcher of the paranormal, or simply seeking out the unknown, perhaps it would be worth your while to check this out further. I, for one, remain fascinated, if not slightly unsettled, by this modern-day legend. Do you have someone you hate? Someone you would do anything to hurt? Pay any price for vengeance? If so, you may want to consider visiting Lightless City. To get there, go to any decent-sized city and find a deserted alleyway at night. Go into it and close your eyes as tightly as you can. Whisper, "Lightless City," and concentrate on the darkness. You can probably notice there are faint colors and abstract shapes you can make out if you focus your eyes when they're closed. Watch those images go by. After a few minutes, the images should start to get clearer and brighter. When this happens, they'll start making detailed forms, images of violent murders, deformed animals, and similar things. No matter what you see, keep your eyes closed. You'll start to lose track of time, but eventually the images will stop, and you'll see pure darkness. Nothing but deep black. No colors or shapes. When you're certain you see pure darkness, open your eyes. You will now be in a very dark city. There won't be a single light or star in the sky. You should be able to see a faint dark blue outline of the tall buildings surrounding you. Make your way out of the alley and walk as quietly as you can down the sidewalk in any direction. If you hear any movement, run as quickly as you can away from the noise. There are animals in Lightless City. It's too dark to make out the details, but they're the size of
large, wild felines and will kill any human they catch. Keep moving until you reach an area with smaller buildings on the edge of the city. A child will approach you, his face dully glowing, letting you see that he is eyeless. He will ask you, "Will you share your light with me?" Say yes. The child will reach for your face and rip out your right eye. It will be painful, but there shouldn't be any bleeding or open wound. The child will thank you and leave. Keep walking, and a tall man will appear before you. Whose light do you wish to have taken away? Speak the name of the person you hate, and as soon as you say their name, they will go completely and irreversibly blind. Is your hatred satisfied? The man will ask. If it is, say yes, and you will be awakened in an alley. If not, say no, and the man will disappear. Keep walking. You will come across another eyeless child. Will you share your light with me? Say yes, and your left eye will be torn out, leaving you blind. Keep walking, and the tall man will appear again, although you, of course, will have to rely on his voice. Whose life do you wish for the darkness to claim? Say the name of the one you hate, and they will die. You will not be asked if your hatred is satisfied this time, and you will not be able to return to the alley. I told you to make sure you really hated someone before doing this. You will spend the rest of your life wandering around Lightless City, blind, with only your hatred to keep you warm. For some people, that's enough.
Back in 1903, deep in Clifton, there used to be an asylum buried deep within the wilderness. Pretty soon after the Civil War, people started inhabiting the area. Population-wise, around 300 or so. It was a very small town. Nonetheless, people didn't like the idea of having an asylum down the road, so they all got together and signed a petition for the asylum to relocate elsewhere. The petition passed, and a new asylum was built, which is now known as Lorton Prison, a temporary facility for convicts to stay in until they are appropriately sentenced. The autumn of 1904, the convicts were gathered and piled into a bus, used to transport them to Lorton. Somewhere during the drive, not too far from where they left, the driver had swerved to avoid something, and the bus had started to tip, and soon was rolling in a terrible collision course. Most of the convicts were injured, but managed to escape the bus and had fled into the night towards the woods. The next morning, a local police investigation had begun, and they began rounding up the escaped convicts. Hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Everyone was recovered after 4 months, except for 2 people, named Marcus A. Walster and Douglas J. Griffin. During the search for both men, the police found dead rabbits, all of them half-eaten and dismembered, every now and then along their search. Finally, they were to find Marcus dead by the Fairfax Station Bridge, now known as Bunnyman's Bridge. In his hand, he held a man-made hammer, knife-like tool, made with a sharp rock and a sturdy branch as a handle. They thought nothing of it and didn't care how he died, only that he was apprehended and they no longer had to worry about him. They had a name for Marcus, but later on they would realize they had named the wrong person, the Bunnyman. Still searching for Douglas, they kept on finding dead half-eaten rabbits every so often. While the search went on, eventually they were to name Douglas the Bunnyman from then on. Months passed by and the police gave up their search. Everybody assumed the Bunnyman was dead by now, if not gone, so they went on with their small-town lives. Come October, people started seeing dead bunnies reappearing out of the blue. and started to fear the unseen. Halloween night came around, and as usual, a bunch of kids had gone over to the bridge that night to drink and do whatever kids their age in the early 20th century did. Midnight came around within minutes, and most of the kids had left. Around 3 of them remained at the bridge. Exactly at midnight, a bright light came from the bridge, right where the kids were. A few seconds later, they were all dead, throat slashed with the same type of tool that was found next to the other escapee, Marcus. Not only were their throats slashed, but they were cut up and down, their chests gutted like fish. The bunnyman had hung both of the boys from the end of the bridge with a rope around their necks, hanging from an overpass with their legs dangling in view of passing cars. The girl was hung the same way, on the other side of the bridge. This happened on Halloween in 1905. After that, they didn't see or hear anything from him for another year. Halloween 1906 was approaching, and parents as well as teens in Clifton still remember the incident that had occurred 1 year ago at the bridge, his bridge, the Bunnyman's bridge. That night, 7 teens were left remaining right before midnight at the bridge. Thinking little of it, 6 remained inside of the bridge, while one, Adrian Hatala, had remained a good distance from the bridge, hoping to have enough time to escape if the same thing happened again. She was the only one to witness this. A dim light walking the railroad track just before midnight, stopping right above the bridge at midnight, then disappearing at the same time that a bright flash was inside the bridge. She heard the deafening sounds of terrified screaming coming from inside the bridge that lasted only seconds. Moments later, they were all hung from the edge of the bridge, in the same way as the corpses a year earlier. Horrified, she ran home and refused to tell all of what she saw. Just spattered words mixed with incoherent mumblings that the people of her town had put together to come up with her story. No one understood it or believed her. They charged her with the teen's murder and locked her up in the asylum of Lorton in 1913. The same thing happened with 9 teenagers this time on Halloween night, once again. Adrian was still locked up. They dropped her sentence, but it was too late. The insanity had finally conquered her. Even if she was released, she was far too gone to have a life. So she spent her remaining years in the asylum until she finally died in 1953 of reported shock. No one knows what exactly she died of shock from, but supposedly she had died in her sleep, dreaming of that one dreaded night. Perhaps the Bunnyman had finally gone to her. More murders were to take place, however, although after the murders in 1913, most people stayed clear of the bridge on Halloween. 1943 rolls around and 6 teenagers go strolling out on Halloween night. A couple hours later, all of them dead, same way as the others. Investigations took place, but as usual, nothing was discovered. 1976, the same situation occurs, this time with only 3 people. The only other incident that occurred since then was in 1987. Janet Charlatier was enjoying the night with her 4 friends. Halloween night had finally come, and they had gone out driving to enjoy the night after invading the children's candy bags. They had settled around 11 p.m. at the bridge, waiting for midnight to come. They didn't believe in the myth, so they decided to see it for themselves, and were to be the only ones who actually withstood the Bunnyman. They had waited around an hour or so it was nearly midnight, when Janet started to get a little scared. They all had been pulling pranks on each other, jumping out of the bushes and screaming, so she was already a little worked up. Midnight hits, and by this stage, she's in a total panic. She's almost out of the bridge when the lights get really bright inside. When that happens, her body is halfway outside the bridge. She sees her skin start tearing at her chest, but nothing is piercing her skin. She manages to finally leave the bridge completely horrified. She hits a hanging body and knocks herself out. When she awakens, she discovers she has been bleeding. She was lucky the cut had just started and wasn't very bad at all. She left and never returned to the bridge again. She has been seen sitting on a swinging bench on her balcony every morning, just staring in the direction towards the bridge, a couple miles down. From then on, the story remains untouched and unmoved. Hello. This thing happened to me a few months ago. I just need to share it with somebody. It all started at my friend's party. He's an artist who rented out a loft in the industrial part of town. If you can picture what a place like Detroit looked like in the 1920s, that's what this area looks like. A bunch of old turn-of-the-century factories crammed into 10 blocks. Most of them are abandoned, so I partied a little too hard that night and decided to crash on a couch at the loft. I woke up around 4 a.m. The sun wasn't out yet, but you can still make things out in the dim blue light. I went to the bathroom, carefully tiptoeing around the people that were passed out on the floor. As I was taking a piss, I tiptoed to look out the bathroom window, and I saw the panorama of deserted urban decay. I remember how much I like places like this. It was so dark and devoid of life and strangely serene, so I went back to the couch and tried to fall asleep. After 45 minutes of staring at the ceiling, I decided I didn't want to be there any longer. So I swallowed my pride and decided to wake my girlfriend up to beg her for a ride, since walking around the vacant streets at this time was not an option. Being an awesome girlfriend, she was totally cool with it and told me she would be there in about half an hour and that she would give me a call when she was outside. My phone died 10 minutes later, so I decided I would sit by the window and watch for her car. I sat there for a while and my eyes started getting heavy and I began to doze off. A crashing noise outside woke me up. It wasn't loud, but just enough to snap me into reality. I looked out the window and scanned the area, but I didn't see anything. Across the street from the loft, near a mountain of garbage bags and one of those enormous dumpsters, I see a computer and a monitor smashed against a floor that hadn't been there before. When my girlfriend arrived, I went downstairs and greeted her. Just as I was about to get in the car, I remembered a friend of mine had blown out his power supply, so I decided to walk over to the dumpster and see what I could salvage. The monitor was worthless, but the tower seemed to have suffered almost no damage, so I put it in the trunk and we drove off. About a week had passed and I had completely forgotten about the tower until my girlfriend called to let me know that it was still in the trunk and that she had wanted it out. That night I had brought it home. Before I took it apart, I decided to hook it up to my monitor to see if it still ran. To my surprise, it did. It ran Windows XP and it looked like it had been wiped clean. I decided to do searches for words like tits and pussy in hopes to find some secret stash of weird deviant porn the previous owner had forgotten about. Morbid curiosity, I guess. Search came up nothing. Search for picture files. Nothing. Then I searched for movies and one file came up. It was a .avi inside a folder titled Barbie, hidden in the Windows 32 directory. So I played it. Now this is where it gets disturbing. The movie was about an hour long and was made up of what seemed like raw exported footage. The footage was of this woman sitting on a chair and talking against a white backdrop. I skipped through most of the movie and it was all the same continuous shot. Then I decided to sit through the footage and find out what she was talking about. 15 seconds into the footage, the audio goes completely bad, and her voice is drowned in harsh, static background noise. I couldn't make out a thing, so I imported the footage into Final Cut and tried to mess with the levels to isolate her voice. It helped a little, but I still couldn't hear what she was saying. I was intrigued now, and I began to really pay attention to her face and body language. It seems that she's being asked some kind of questions because she stops at times to listen and then continues talking. About 15 minutes into the footage, her face begins to redden and contort as if the questions are bothering her, but she continues to answer them anyway. Shortly after, she begins to cry. She sobs hysterically for the duration of the film. One of the few words I could lip read was skin. She repeats this word many times throughout the footage, and at one point, she even pulls at the skin from her arm and mouths a word. She seems to be unhappy with her skin. There's much more I have to get off my chest, but it's getting late and I can't go on. I will share the rest tomorrow. God save my soul. It kept building and building, and about 40 minutes in, She's crying so hard she can barely look at the camera. She stops talking at this point, and the rest of the footage is just her crying with her head down. Oddly enough, she doesn't get up to move. The screen just fades to black. I was fucking dumbfounded. I played the whole thing through many times that night, trying to find inflections and nuances in her movements that would reveal anything else about what was going on. I felt so dissatisfied. I wanted to know more. That's when I noticed that there were about 10 more minutes left on the timeline after the screen went black. And about 2 minutes in, there was more footage. The footage was extremely shaky, almost unwatchable, and depicted a pair of legs walking along train tracks. My guess is that the camera was accidentally left on as it was being carried somewhere. The person in this footage walks along the train tracks for about 6 minutes, and then turns into the forest and walks over what looked like foliage flattened by a piece of plywood. The person continues on this makeshift plywood road until the movie clip ends. Now my heart started beating with excitement because there were train tracks a few miles away that looked to be similar to the ones in the video. I had to check this out. I called up my friend Ezra. He's 6'4", 250 pounds of mostly muscle. I convinced him to go on a little adventure with me. I'm no pushover myself, but I felt if I was to go wandering in the woods looking for God knows what, extra muscle couldn't hurt. This whole idea of investigating this video had me so excited I couldn't sleep. The next morning, on a sunny Saturday, I took my flashlight, my camera, and my 7-inch K-bar with a matte black finish and serrated edge and went to pick up Ezra. When I got to his house, he wasn't even awake. When I woke him, he pretty much told me to fuck off. I was already packed, and I had mentally prepared myself to do this, so I decided to go through with it without him. I parked my car at the train station, took my stuff, and hopped onto the tracks. After walking for about 2 hours, I saw a broken piece of plywood, and my knees almost buckled with excitement. I searched the nearby foliage, and there it was, a little plywood trail leading into the forest. I walked slowly along the trail, paying close attention to everything. I would stop occasionally, kneel down, and listen for anything or anyone, but it was so quiet. This was one of the most nerve-wracking things I've ever done. I didn't know what to expect at the end of this trail. The dense tree line gave way to a little island of grassy field, and then I saw it, a house being consumed by the forest. From the looks of it, no one had lived there for 20, maybe 30 years. I got my camera and snapped a few pics. A few yards away from the house was a tool shed made of rusty sheet metal. I just sat there among the trees for a while, absorbing everything. I didn't want to go into the open field. I had this bad feeling that something would see me. It took me a while to muster the courage up to go to the house. The door was partly opened. I pushed it in with the flashlight and was revealed that the inside was actually very well lit. I put my flashlight away, got my camera, and took a few more pics. There was no furniture. The floor was riddled with bricks and wood and rubble, and some of the walls had huge holes in them. When I went in further to explore, I saw some things that I didn't pay much mind to at the moment, but now that I think about them in hindsight, they greatly disturb me. The first thing that seemed a little odd was that one of the doors in the first room that I presume led to the basement seemed a little too new to be in this house. It was also the only door in the house that was locked. Also, when I made my way up the second floor, I saw some chairs and a fold-up table that also seemed a little too new to be there. But what disturbed me the most, for some reason, was the bathroom. The dust on the mirror had been wiped away, and in the bathtub I saw a clear plastic tarp that still had water droplets on it from when I presumed it was washed clean. That's when I heard something moan really loud, and that's when I jumped the fuck out of the second-story window and ran back to the tracks. Halfway there, I realized the moaning was most likely a water pipe expanding or contracting, and that little moment of relief gave in to the horror which I felt when I wondered why the water would be running on an abandoned house in the middle of the fucking woods. It's been a little more than 2 months since this happened, and I haven't gone back there, nor do I plan to.
This is a crazy story that I wouldn't have believed had it not happened to me.
I'm not prone or drawn to the supernatural, and in fact, I have a strong Christian support system. But what I experienced has no other explanation other than the unexplained. This is a true story about a rubber ducky. I don't feel that in good conscience I can keep this thing in my house. It wouldn't be fair to my family, and frankly, I've lost enough sleep over it as it is. I spoke at length with my pastor, and together we came up with the idea to sell it with full disclosure. Any other method, and we would risk the duck falling into unsuspecting hands. We knew that the only way to get rid of him without personal condemnation was to be open, honest, and forthright. We knew the person getting the duck would have to know the whole story and accept the consequences freely. We felt the only way to do this was to be sure the story would be read, understood, and accepted. So here it is. My son, now 2, received this rubber ducky as a gift from an aunt when he was approximately 10 or 11 months old. He was very enthusiastic about his bath time and loved the new addition to the tub. He named the duck Yella, his personal pronunciation of yellow, and of course, the color of the duck. Now, as with most kids, their tastes change and can be at times fickle. In fact, suggesting that all kids have some level of ADD would not be a stretch. Soon, Yellow lost some of his appeal in the eyes of my son. He requested the duck's company less and less as time wore on, until such a time where Yellow was all about forgotten. We originally thought nothing of it. Then as time went on, my son began to speak more and was able to articulate his thoughts. He started referring more and more to his old friend Yella. The problem was that it wasn't in a positive or childish manner. In fact, it was really quite disturbing. He repeatedly made reference to fights he and Yella had, and a subsequent scar inflicted on the left side of the duck's head. At first we just figured he had an active imagination, and that eventually he would forget about Yella, but he never did. In fact, each time he told the story, he did it with more detail and more emotion, until his mother and I finally forbid him from telling the story at all. In fact, my wife was so distressed she searched out the duck and vowed to dispose of it. At this point, our son had an unnerving attachment to Yella. He would never let the duck out of his sight. He was never affectionate towards the duck. He just insisted that the toy always be around no matter what. He was about 1.5 years by now, and there was certainly no bargaining with him. Every time we tried to take the toy, our son would lose it, literally crying bloody murder. Needless to say, there was no way of coaxing the duck away, and despite our best efforts, the stories continued. We hoped and prayed that his obsession with Yella pass with time. We even found ourselves spoiling him in an effort to replace the duck. It was useless. One night, our son and Yella were having a bath together, with several of the other bath toys collected over the course of the previous year. There was a boat, a whale, a starfish, a small action figure, and some miscellaneous plastic tools. Our son's overall interest in Yella had dwindled to the point of sheer indifference. In fact, if he had his way, the duck wouldn't have been in the tub. Instead, it was because of his mother's lapse in judgment that Yella was included at all. He went about playing and splashing with his other toys, all the while ignoring the duck, intentionally or not. It was at this point our son noticed the other toys in the tub changing shape, distorting and losing their color into the water. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew something wasn't right. He also noticed that Yellow was eerily positioned at the end of the tub, dead center, and facing him directly. He also noticed the duck's shape hadn't changed, and his color appeared to be as bright as ever. It seemed as though the toys were melting before him. It was at this point that he reached out to grab the duck, almost mesmerized by his yellow body. As he grabbed the duck, he felt a piercing pain in the palm of his hand, and immediately threw the toy back into the water. He was sure he had been bitten. Anger flooded our son, and again he grabbed at Yella, and this time He wasted no time in throwing the duck across the room. The duck crashed against the raised corner of the toilet paper holder, bounced off the wall, and came to rest at my feet as I now stood in the doorway of the bathroom. By now my wife was aware of our son's rage and the events taking place. She threw down her magazine, jumped off her stool, and lunged across the washroom towards our son. She scooped him up into her arms. My wife and I looked at each other, tried to process the evidence before us. All the while, our little one cried and shouted at the rubber ducky on the floor. As I mentioned before, if it had not happened to us, I would have never given it a second thought, and I certainly would have dismissed the author as a quack and the story as a farce. We immediately checked the temperature of the water. It was lukewarm. We searched the bathroom high and low for chemicals or agents which may have caused this reaction in the toys. Nothing was found. Our son was not burned, and with the exception of a small cut on the palm of his hand, there was no sign of injury. Being cautious, we packed our son in the car and headed for the emergency room. As expected, nothing was found to be abnormal. We then rushed to the home of our pastor. We've never been fanatical with respect to our religious beliefs, but we felt like there was something unholy and unexplainable here that needed to be addressed. Our pastor assured us there had to be an earthly explanation, but at the same time, he had an unsettled look that left us feeling a little doubtful. We left and headed home, exhausted and anxious to put this night behind us. At home, we rushed upstairs to our son's room, got him into his pajamas, and said our goodnight prayers. Our son seemed distant and agitated, but soon relented to his own exhaustion. My wife and I returned downstairs to the main floor bathroom and the scene of this evening's event. Everything was as we left it, with one exception. Yellow was back in the tub, dead center and facing us directly. We looked at each other in the hope the other would appear calm and composed. It didn't happen. Instead, we stared at each other, waiting for an acknowledgement of who had put the duck back in the tub. That didn't happen either. I immediately grabbed up the duck and without hesitation placed him in the closest container I could find, a Tupperware-style container on the counter in the kitchen. I then stormed out the garage and tossed the container on the workbench, while I headed back in the house to try and comprehend what had just happened. It was at this point I picked up the phone and called our pastor, and how we find ourselves in the position we are in today. I can't explain what happened, and the sooner I can put the events of that night and this duck behind me, the better off I'll be. I will not be responsible for the duck after shipping. I will not field questions or help to explain its unusual mystique. I want nothing to do with it. The winning bidder must understand this. I don't want someone to find this thing in a dumpster or buy it at a garage sale. I want the person who gets it to understand what they have and not to take it lightly. And for God's sake, I don't want it near children. I'd be just as happy if you buried it in the Tupperware container it's still in. I hope you can respect my wishes. Thank you.
When thinking back to my earliest memories, nothing is concrete. A string of hazy images come to mind, like random snapshots out of time. Each one is associated with certain feelings and emotions. They are imbued with a mystical, dreamlike quality, a gift born of childhood naivety. The magic of every Christmas when Santa was real, for example, is an experience of pure joy that is lost with maturity. Many of these snapshots are impossible to place in any sort of context. They're just there, sunken in the crevices of a brain without rhyme or reason. Playing with my dad's beard in a wood-paneled room, him smiling down at me is comforting. Or discovering a long row of marching ants in someone's wooded backyard all by myself. Exciting. Some of them don't even seem real in hindsight. Did I actually fall from that tree by the lake only to land on my feet without a scratch? Was it really a dream? I don't think so. Sure, I have memories of distant dreams, but there's a clear distinction between the dreams and reality of my past. I don't know how I can tell, I just can. And for this reason, one memory has always troubled me. The experience was so surreal, and yet certain details stand out with marked clarity. Not exactly sure when it happened. I couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. My brother and I were sleeping in our bunk bed. Because he was older, he got the top bunk. I'd just woken up, but it was still nighttime. Something felt different. I remember seeing and smelling the rain, but not hearing any. The window was open, and it was very cold in the room. Why was the window open? The curtains were gently flapping, but there was no breeze. The quiet was so intense it buzzed through my ears. I'd been lying on my side with one arm dangling off the edge of the bed. Gradually I became aware that it was warmer near the floor. I felt some kind of heated breeze gently striking my hand, coming and going in short bursts. Finally I recognized it as someone's breathing. Then the woman slid out from under my bed. The nightlight showed that she had long, blondish hair and wore a white nightgown, and in the dimness, I thought it was my mother. I wasn't at all scared. It's funny how a child's mind works. What's mommy doing under the bed? Must be getting something or checking for monsters. I was too tired to say anything and remained motionless watching. The woman was on her back, but her face stayed in the shadows. She rolled over and clawed on all fours to the end of the bed, then glided up the ladder to the top bunk. Her every movement was silky smooth and completely silent. She reminded me of a white ribbon dancing in the wind. I closed my eyes and fell back asleep. I also remember my brother telling me about a weird dream he had the next morning. He dreamt of a woman that lived under the floor and came out at night to play in the rain. When her clothes got soaked, she went back inside and would whisper things to anyone who was sleeping. It became a reoccurring dream for him until our family moved out of that house. Strange what the brain chooses to remember. SkyShell003 says, does anyone remember this kid's show? It was called Candle Cove, and I must have been 6 or 7. I never found reference to it anywhere, so I think it was a local station around 1971 or 1972. I lived in Ironton at the time. I don't remember which station, but I do remember it was on at a weird time, like 4 p.m. Mike Painter 65 says, it seems really familiar to me. I grew up outside of Ashland when I was 9 years old in 72. Candle Cove, it was about pirates. I remember a pirate marionette at the mouth of a cave talking to a little girl. SkyShell003 replies, yes, okay, I'm not crazy. I remember Pirate Percy. I was always kind of scared of him. He looked like he was built of parts of other dolls. Really low budget. His head was an old porcelain baby doll. Looked like an antique that didn't belong on the body. I don't remember what the station was. I don't think it was WTSF though. Jaren 2005 says, sorry to resurrect this old thread, but I know exactly what show you mean, SkyShale. I think Candle Cove ran for a couple months in 71, not 72. I was 12 and I watched it a few times with my brother. It was channel 58, whatever station that was. My mom would let me switch to it after the news. Let me see what I remember. It took place in Candle Cove, and it was about a little girl who imagined herself to be friends with pirates. The pirate ship was called the Laughingstock, and Pirate Percy wasn't a very good pirate because he got scared too easily, and there was calliope music constantly playing. Don't remember the girl's name, Janice or Jade or something. I think it was Janice. SkyShell003 replies, thank you, Jaren. Memories flooded back when you mentioned the Laughingstock in channel 58. I remember the bow of the ship was a wooden smiling face with the lower jaw submerged. It looked like it was swallowing the sea, and it had an awful Edwin voice and laugh. I especially remember how jarring it was when they switched from the wooden/plastic model to the foam puppet version of the head that talked. Mike Painter 65 replies, I remember that too. Do you remember the part, SkyShale? You have to go inside. SkyShell003 replies, "Ugh, Mike, I got a chill reading that. Yes, I remember. That's what the ship always told Percy when there was a spooky place he had to go in, like a cave or a dark room where the treasure was. And the camera would push in on the laughingstock's face. And with each pause, 'You have to go inside,' with his two eyes askew and flopping foam jaw. And the fishing line that opened and closed it. Ugh, it looked so cheap and awful." You guys remember the villain? He had a face that was just a handlebar mustache above really tall, narrow teeth. Kevin Hart says, "I honestly thought the villain was Pirate Percy. I was about 5 when the show was on Nightmare Fuel." Jared 2005 replies, "That wasn't the villain. The puppet with the mustache? That was the villain's sidekick, Horse Horrible. He had a monocle too, but it was on top of his mustache. I used to think that meant he had only one eye. But yeah, the villain was another marionette, the Skin Taker. I can't believe they let us watch that back then." Kevin Hart replies, "Jesus H. Christ, the Skin Taker. What kind of kids show are we watching? I seriously could not look at the screen when the Skin Taker showed up. He just descended out of nowhere on a string, just a dirty skeleton wearing that brown top hat and cape, and his glass eyes that were too big for his skull. Christ almighty." SkyShell003 replies, "Wasn't his top hat and cloak all sewn up crazy? Was that supposed to be children's skin?" Mike Pater 65 replies, "Yeah, I think so. Remember his mouth didn't open and close? His jaw just slid back and forth. I remember the little girl said, 'Why does your mouth move like that?' And the Skin Taker didn't look at the girl but at the camera and said, 'To grind your skin.'" SkyShell003 replied, "I'm so relieved that other people remember this terrible show. I used to have this awful memory, a bad dream I had where the opening jingle ended and the show faded from black and all the characters were there, but the camera was just cutting to each of their faces and they were just screaming and the puppets and marionettes were flailing spastically and just screaming. The girl was just moaning and crying like she had been through hours of this. I woke up many times from that nightmare. I used to wet the bed when I had it." Kevin Hart replied, "I don't think that was a dream. I remember that was an episode." SkyShell003 replies, No, that's not possible. There's no plot or anything. I mean, literally just standing in place crying and screaming for the whole show." Kevin Hart replies, "Maybe I'm manufacturing the memory because you said that, but I swear to God I remember seeing what you described. They just screamed." Jared 2005 replies, "Oh God, yes, the little girl Janice, I remember seeing her shake, and the Skin Taker screaming through his gnashing teeth, his jaw craning so wildly. I thought it would come off its wire hinges. I turned it off, and it was the last time I watched. I ran to tell my brother, and we didn't have the courage to turn it back on." Mike Painter 65 replies, "I visited my mom today at the nursing home. I asked her about when I was little in the early 70s. When I was 8 or 9, and if she remembered a kid's show, Candle Cove. She said she was surprised I could remember that, and I asked why, and she said, because I used to think it was so strange that you said, 'I'm going to go watch Candle Cove now, Mom,' and then you would tune the TV to static and just watch dead air for 30 minutes. You had a big imagination with your little pirate show." In 2009, an amateur video artist studying in the UK uploaded a video onto YouTube of a recent piece he had completed. After many reports and complaints, the video was taken down. The piece allegedly begins with a lingering shot of a foggy meadow that some believe to be located in Ireland. The only sound throughout this shot is a light hissing and what sounds like muffled, unintelligible speech. The camera starts zooming in on a white shape in a field. After several tedious minutes, the shape reveals itself to be an albino deer. A close-up shot of its eyes suddenly appears, showing signs of infection and possibly the beginning stages of blindness within them. The following shot is a scene of the deer staring at a vanity mirror for about a minute. After this, the piece takes a turn for the bizarre, with the deer in the reflection moving in dissonance with the real one. Zooming in, the camera focuses on the deer in the reflection, which has begun to move about in an unnatural and grotesque fashion, as if something was modeling it like a piece of clay. As these unnerving contortions continue, the camera zooms out, showing a shot of the real deer lying on the ground. People have described the deer as looking strangely at peace. The shot goes on for roughly 2 minutes. The reflection is still twisting and gesticulating, but the mirror itself seems to be growing darker. The deer lying on the ground then starts to excrete a dark fluid from under its tail, suggesting that a birth is about to occur. The tar-like substance continues to bubble and seep out of the deer and onto the ground. This is a point where many people claim to have stopped watching. Some accounts vary on what happens next, but many describe a scene where a stillborn humanoid infant is birthed from the deer, covered in the dark tar-like sludge that makes it hard to describe exactly what it looks like. Some have claimed it was a model of a human-animal hybrid put together by the artist for the sake of this film. A blurry close-up shot of the hybrid's face is seen for a few seconds before it cuts back to the mirror, now broken, with the same field from the beginning. Black and white stock footage of an audience applauding is shown in slow motion, and then the film ends with a 5-minute shot of black screen accompanied by an unintelligible murmuring slowly fading in the volume. Many say that the film can no longer be found online, while others say the audio track is sometimes circulated around file-sharing programs like BitTorrent. There are even some who claim to have attained the film itself through such means. Occasionally, screenshots surface on image boards and other such sites, but the film itself has hardly been seen since its initial debut. A year later, the artist posted another video on YouTube. This time, it was just 5 minutes of a black screen and silence, with just a link to a webcam site in the description to serve as evidence. Viewers describe seeing a pair of dangling pale feet slightly rotating above a knocked-over chair. The creator of the video Cervine Birth is best known for this shocking final piece, but many are not as aware of his earlier works, which are similar in terms of content and style. Shot in black and white, the piece, often referred to as Foxtrot, was created in early 2005. The film begins with a shot of a moonlit forest with a slow fade to the beginning of the first scene. A gaunt, malnourished-looking fox is seen staggering through the forest, wailing and crying out in a haunting voice, with what appears to be a noose tied around its neck. The camera follows the rope to the end, where the fox cubs can be seen dragging behind. It isn't certain whether the cubs are dead or not. The film cuts to a brief shot of the crescent moon as it slowly devolves into a shapeless blur. The soundtrack for the film so far has consisted mostly of the fox's wailings and a wailing musical track many describe as unnatural and unnerving. It cuts to a clearing in the forest. The fox is seen ambling toward the center, still dragging her young behind her. The music gradually fades into silence as the fox is curling up on the ground, getting ready to die. After a few moments, with nothing but her final breaths breaking up the silence, a close-up of her face is shown. Her eyes are still glimmering under the moonlight. A pair of small, pale, childlike hands start to caress her face. More small hands start showing up in the shot before the camera slowly zooms out to show much of the fox's body being covered in caressing hands and arms. The shot flickers out a few times before cutting to the interior of a darkened household. The camera slowly makes its way into a dining room, where a family of corpses is shown decaying in their seats. On the table is the same fox, but this time it's alive and healthy, tending to her cubs. Close-up shots of the bodies follow. revealing them to possess wounds indicating a possible mass suicide. In the closing shot, a moth is seen fluttering about a dangling light bulb in a dark room, when a hand that can only be described as animal-like reaches up and shuts it off. The story of Edward Mordrake, or Mordrake according to other sources, is one of the strangest and most enigmatic in modern medicine. Edward was born in England in the 19th century, and it is said that his family was one of the richest in the region. His father was especially excited about his birth, since he longed to have a male heir who could continue the family tradition, since they previously had 2 daughters. But luck was not on the Mordrake family's side, because even though Edward was a boy, just as they had always dreamed, there was something unusual and chilling about the newborn. On the back of his neck, you could see a second face that was smaller and had different features than the original. Over time, his back face began to reveal the diabolical nature. For although he was unable to speak or eat, he could be seen smiling every time Edward cried or felt pain. Furthermore, he followed the people passing behind Edward with his eyes and moved his lips as if he were speaking, although he did not make any sound, or at least none, that could be heard by anyone other than Edward. His unusual curse led Edward to seclude himself in his room, not allowing anyone to see him, not even his family. However, Edward became a very cultured and refined person, as he was an avid reader and a very talented musician. But the most terrifying thing about his demonic twin was that, according to Edward, it whispered to him at night and kept him from falling asleep. According to Edward, his diabolical twin never slept and whispered to him in a language that seemed to come from hell itself. Edward claimed that he was sewn into a demon, and asked several surgeons to separate him from the terrible face that tormented him, even if it cost him his own life. But no doctor considered it possible to carry out this extraction, and Edward had to resign himself to a living with a demon on the back of his head, until one day his suffering was so great that, taking advantage of the carelessness of other people in his care, he obtained a poison that ended his life when he was only 23 years old. After his death, he left a suicide note, in which he thanked his parents and sisters for the love they had given him, and asked for their forgiveness for the damage and pain his death may have caused them. Likewise, he made one last request, that they should tear my diabolical face from my lifeless body and bury me in Valadin land, without a cross or a stone or something that says where my body is. Maybe, just maybe, Edward was afraid that his devilish face would find him again and continue with his whispers even in death.
In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of the scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functioning eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so that he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I've spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death.
After my last experience, my parents reminded me of another story from my childhood. When you're 5, your mind lacks the experience to make informed judgments or connect things which aren't obvious. Over the years, the details get fuzzy and forgotten. Speaking with my parents the other day, they cleared the cobwebs bearing the story. I remember now much too clearly the story of Gurgles and Bugman. I just started kindergarten that year. Everyone's a friend when you're 5, so I had no shortage of classmates. But coming from a poor family, I didn't get to see much of them outside of school. My parents spent all their waking hours trying to make ends meet and didn't have time to ferry me from house to house. So I spent my early years mostly keeping to myself, playing with random assortment of knickknacks from the shelf in my room. Being short on money gave my family a habit of hoarding, so they hated to throw anything out. One particular item on the shelf was a small, old-fashioned TV set, a wooden veneer box about 2 feet wide by a foot tall. It had a curved glass screen that took up half the front panel. Beside the screen was a large chrome dial used to switch channels. At the top sat an antenna, formed by 2 terribly twisted wires. When my boredom made me turn it on, I'd usually get static and snow on that glowing black and white screen. I'd twist the heavy, clicking dial, hoping to pick up some local broadcast. Mostly it would be some ghostly images and incoherent sound fragments. But one channel was always crystal clear. It was the Gurgles and Bugman show. Gurgles was a clown, but not a common one. He wore a thin black suit that draped his tall, skinny body, with a matching tie and oversized novelty clown shoes to complete his distinctive outfit. His pupils were completely black, like polished ebony marbles, with no trace of white around them. Black face paint around those eyes and across his cheeks and mouth made him look like a manic, grinning skeleton. It was only the crazy crop of curly hair sprouting off the sides of his head that gave him a more human look. As much as Gurgles freaked me out, Bugman scared me more. He was short and round, like a hunchback dwarf. With a dark cape, he had prosthetics covering his eyes to make him look like a fly, and a mouth that rotated 90 degrees and opened from side to side. The show itself was like candid camera, with pranks played on unsuspecting people. It would always start with Gurgles and Bugman hidden away at someone's home. Gurgles would face the camera staring at you, his bony finger touching his lips. When the unsuspecting star of the show came into view, a laugh track would begin to play. You would see them go about their nightly routines, oblivious to the conspiracy that Gurgles and Bugman had involved us in. We'd see them making dinner, or on the lounge watching TV with their family, or quietly doing their homework. Then watch as Gurgles and Bugman stole their pin, or moved their glass, or made things disappear behind their backs. The camera angles would change as Gurgles and Bugman shifted their hiding place from the dark corners of the room to the cupboards, to the ceiling, or under the furniture, all the while looking back at you and winking. The closer they got, the louder and more laughter from the soundtrack. Eventually, when everyone went to sleep, a victim would be chosen for their prank. Waiting in the closet or under the bed, once their victim fell asleep, Bugman would crawl out and gently climb in beside them. His jaw would open sideways, and out would come a sharp straw that he'd stick in the person's neck. This always paralyzed the victim, because sometimes you could see them struggle if they woke and saw Gurgles and Bugman on top of them. The laugh track would then be extra loud and uproarious. Those few times, the victims awoke. Gurgles would make faces at the camera while the audience laughed, and Bugman would use his straw to drink the person's neck. When the victim stopped struggling after a few minutes, and the laughter would turn to claps and cheering. With Bugman finished, Gurgles' face would fill the whole screen with his impossibly wide, sharp-toothed grin. Then he'd whisper, "See you again soon." The way those all-black eyes pierced through the screen always gave me the chills. I hated the show, but would be always too afraid to go near the TV while it was running. One day, the TV mysteriously disappeared from my room. My parents told me that they sold it to pay some bills. I accepted that without question. I was kind of glad it was gone. But yesterday, when I asked them about the TV, again they exchanged nervous glances, then filled in some missing gaps from my childhood. Halfway through the year, Derek, a classmate I didn't know very well, had died in a horrific circumstance. He was murdered in his bed with a stab wound to the neck. No evidence of a break-in was ever found, so his distraught parents were taken into custody as the primary suspects. They denied all the allegations against them. At the time, Miss Nolan, my teacher, told our class I'd apparently explained to her that Derek couldn't be dead because I saw him and his family on the Gurgles and Bugman show the day before. When Miss Nolan mentioned to my parents what I'd said, they had immediately taken the TV from my room, driven to the junkyard, and had it burnt to nothing but ashes and molten metal. That TV was in my room because it was always broken. It was never plugged in the whole time it was on my shelf. Whatever I saw on that screen, it wasn't from a station. So that's my story of Gurgles and Bugman. But I'm not sure if that's really the end, though. After all, do Gurgles and Bugman still perform their nightly show for some unsuspecting viewer somewhere in this world? And if so, who would be their next star? I'd recently spawned a new world in single-player Minecraft. Everything was normal at first, as I began chopping down trees and crafting a workbench. I noticed something moving amongst the dense fog. I have a very slow computer, so I have to play with a very tiny render distance. I thought it was a cow, so I pursued it, hoping to grab some hides for armor. It wasn't a cow, though. Looking back at me was another character with the default skin, but his eyes were empty. I saw no name pop up, and I double-checked to make sure I wasn't in multiplayer mode. He didn't stay long. He looked at me and quickly ran into the fog. I pursued out of curiosity, but he was gone. I continued on with the game, not sure what to think. As I expanded the world, I saw things that seemed out of place for the random map generator to make. 2x2 tunnels in the rocks, small perfect pyramids made of sand in the ocean, and groves of trees with all their leaves cut off. I would constantly think I saw the other player in the deep fog, but I never got a better look at him. I tried increasing my render distance to far whenever I thought I saw him, but to no avail. I saved the map and went to the forums to see if anyone else had found the pseudo player. There were none. I created my own topic telling of the man and asking if anyone had similar experiences. The post was deleted within 5 minutes. I tried again, and the topic was deleted even faster. I received a PM from username herobrine containing one word: stop. When I went to look at Herobrine's profile, the page for a Ford. I received an email from another forum user. He claimed the mods can read the forum user's messages, so we were safer using email. The emailer claimed that he had seen the mysterious player too, and had a small directory of other users who had seen him as well. Their worlds were littered with obvious man-made features as well, and described their mystery player to have no pupils. About a month passed until I heard from my informant again. Some of the people who had encountered the mystery man had looked into the name Herobrine and found that it was to be frequently used by a Swedish gamer. After some further information gathering, it was revealed to be the brother of Notch, the game's developer. I personally emailed Notch and asked him if he had a brother. Took him a while, but he emailed me back a very short message. I did, but he's no longer with us. I haven't seen the mystery man since our first encounter, and I haven't noticed any changes to the world other than my own. I was able to press print screen when I first saw him. Here's the only evidence of his existence.
I've been lying down for hours now. It's 5:35 a.m., and there's not much I can do. You know what the worst part of my situation is? I'm in the same room as my parents. They keep looking at me, and I can't help but look back and try not to cry or scream. Their eyes are focused on me, and their mouths are wide open. There's a strong scent of blood, and I feel paralyzed with fear. Here's the thing. The second I make any hint that I'm not asleep anymore, I'm completely fucked. I will die, and there's nobody around to save me. I've been trying to think of a way out, but the only idea I have is to rush for the front door and scream for help, hoping any neighbors hear me. It's risky, but if I stay here, I'll surely die. He's waiting for me to wake up and see his masterpiece. You're probably wondering what's going on. I do tend to get ahead of myself sometimes. About 3 hours ago, I heard screaming from the other side of the house. I got up and went to check on the noise before realizing I had to use the restroom. Instead of doing the smart thing first and investigating, I used the bathroom first. I could have gotten myself killed right then for my stupid actions. I did my business and took a peek outside the bathroom. There was blood on the carpet. I got very worried and ran back to my room. Hiding under the sheets like the pussy I was, I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep. That was just some really vivid dream or something. But I heard my bedroom door open. Like the terrified child I was, I peeked out from under my blankets to see what was going on. I could see something dragging my dead parents into the room. It was not human, I can tell you that. It was hairless, with no eyes or clothing. It walked like a caveman, with its back slouched as it dragged my parents. But this thing was much smarter than any caveman. It was aware of what it was doing. It propped my dad up on the edge of my bed and made him face me. It then sat my mother down in the chair and positioned her towards me as well. It then started rubbing its hands on the walls, staining them with blood, and then drew a circle with the devil's pentagram in it. This thing had made what it probably called a masterpiece. To finish it off, it scribbled a message into the wall that I could not read in the darkness. It then positioned itself under my bed, waiting to strike. The scariest thing now is my eyes have adjusted to the darkness since then, and I can read the message on the wall. I don't want to look at it, because it's terrifying to think about it. But I feel I need to see before I'm killed. I peek at the creature's masterpiece. I know you're awake. During my childhood, my family was like a drop of water in a vast river. We never remained in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there are fragments in the attic of my brain which belong to the various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless. Chasing after another boy in the backyard of a house in North Carolina. Trying to build a raft to float on a creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania. And so on. But there is one set of memories which remains as clear as glass, as though they were just made yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams produced by the long sickness I experienced that spring. But in my heart, I know that they are real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, population 643. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't see in the 5 months we resided there. In some ways it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute of my father's place of work. The day after my 5th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was horrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks. Boredom always loomed just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth, because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body, his head, his eyes, his crooked ears. His mouth was by far the largest. "You look like a Furby," I said, as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look. "Furby? What's a Furby?" he asked. I shrugged. "You know, the toy? The little robot with big ears. You can pet and feed him. Almost like a real pet?" "Oh." Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity. "You don't need one of those. They aren't the same as having a real friend." I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stopped by to check in on me. "I lay under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore." We didn't do much during those first few days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The third or fourth morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face. "I have a new game we can play," he said. "We have to wait until after your mother comes to check on you, because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game." After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under the bed and tugged my hand. "We have to go to the room at the end of this hallway," he said. I objected at first, as my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission. But Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open. He then beckoned me to look out at the ground below. We were on the second story of the house, but it was on a hill, and from this angle the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline. "I like to play pretend up here," Mr. Widemouth explained. "I pretend that there is a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try." I was only a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. "It's a long drop," I said. "But that's all part of the fun." "But it wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop. If it were that way, you may as well just jump on a rail trampoline." I toyed with this idea, picturing myself falling through thin air only to bounce back to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed. "Maybe some other time," I said. "I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt." Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment. "If you say so," he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning, Mr. Widemouth arrived, holding a small box. "I want to teach you how to juggle," he said. "Here are some things you can use to practice before I start giving you lessons." I looked in the box. It was full of knives. "My parents would kill me," I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. "I'll be spanked and grounded for a year." Mr. Widemouth frowned. "It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it." He pushed the box away. "I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air." Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there for the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night saying he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep. Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of the sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. "I have something I want you to see," he said. I must have given him a weird look because he said, "It's safe, I promise." I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind the house. "This is an important path," he explained. "I've had a lot of friends about your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day I hope to take you there." I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last load of our things had been packed into a moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father, for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps the creature's intentions were not to my benefit. Despite that, he said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck at 4 a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow. with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a six-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a man who was about to run a marathon rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still. "Early enough for you?" my father asked with a hint of sympathy. I nodded and placed my head against the window,
hoping for some sleep.
Before the sun came up, I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's hard for you, as sick as you've been. Once Daddy gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends." I opened my eyes as we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in the bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave a pitiful little wave goodbye, steak knife in hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house had burned down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out from behind a tree and scare the living bejesus out of me. But I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belonged to children.
Everyone knows that if you surf the web long enough, you'll see some pretty sick shit. This is especially true if you intentionally dwell into the dark underbelly of the internet. I've seen quite a few things I don't care to admit to, but one thing that I'll always remember is a site called Normal Porn for Normal People. The first strange thing about this site was that I didn't find it by actually looking for it. It was emailed to me by someone I didn't know. The email was as follows. "Hi there. Found this site. It's very nice. Thought you might like. normalpornfornormalpeople.com. Pass it on for the good of mankind." Pretty standard issue chain letter, although the URL in the last remark really piqued my curiosity. I was having a boring day when I got this, so I made sure my antivirus was working, and then I clicked on it. It was a very average, generic-looking site. It gave the impression that the creators just barely gave a shit about making it look professional. The author seemed to have a very tenuous grasp on English, and on the front page was a long, boring, and incoherent rant that I don't remember or have saved. The site had a strange tagline, which even today, people haven't figured out the meaning of, which was "Normal Porn for Normal People," a website dedicated to the eradication of abnormal sexuality. And from the sound of that, I wasn't sure whether I was watching porn or if I had stumbled on some kind of eugenics program. But I was here now, and I was very, very curious to see what normal people get their rocks off to. So I scrolled down through the rant, and nothing. The page didn't link to anywhere else, and I was about to leave when I noticed every word of the rant had its own hyperlink. So I clicked on one of them and was sent to a white page with very long list of links in the form of normalpornfornormalpeople.com/random letters. So I stopped for a minute and asked myself if I really wanted to waste God knows how much time clicking on random links that will likely give me a virus that will rape my computer. I figured I'd just try it for maybe 5 minutes just to see if anything came up. I clicked one of the links and was sent to another page. This page apparently had totally different URLs than the last one. I was about to say fuck this when I clicked on the third link and a video download came up. It was called peanut.avi. It was a 30-minute video of a man, a woman, and a dog in a kitchen. The woman would make a peanut butter sandwich. The man would set it down for the dog to eat. And this all happened for 30 minutes. And it was obvious that the cameraman had to stop filming and wait until the dog was ready to eat again. And the dog seemed rather sick by the end of it. I know what you're thinking. What the hell does this have to do with porn? I have no clue. I've seen a little over 24 videos from the site, and the majority had no sexual activity at all. After watching peanut.avi, I went on a certain image board I frequent to play online show and tell, like I always do with weird shit like this. But someone had already made a thread about it, some guy who had received the same chain letter I did. The image board thread got lots of people with nothing better to do than dig through the site, and that's how I saw other videos. Most of those 24 videos were very uneventful and consisted of two people talking to the cameraman in a room with nothing in it but a desk and a few chairs. I mean, literally nothing on the walls or in terms of furniture. The whole room had a very cold and sterile feel to it. The conversations were just idle banter about previous jobs or embarrassing childhood moments. I kept expecting some kind of discussion about what the people were filming or what the site was about, but of course nothing. You would never know these videos had anything to do with porn if you saw it out of context. I'll say one thing though, the people who appeared in these videos were quite attractive. However, the other videos that actually did feature content, which I suppose could be called sexual, is where things got weird. I'll give you a brief description of the stranger videos. If you're really eaten up with curiosity, you can try to hunt them down on a torrent site. lickclean.avi, a 10-minute video filmed by a hidden camera in which we see a repairman working on a washing machine for the first 2 minutes. When it's fixed, the repairman talks to the owner briefly and then leaves. The owner checks to make sure the repairman is gone, and he begins to lick all over the top of the washing machine. This goes on for about 7 minutes. Jimbo.avi, a 5-minute video of an obese mime performing his act. It was actually pretty funny, particularly one part where he pretends to pull up a chair, then pretends to break it because of his weight. In the last 30 seconds of the video, the camera cuts to static briefly and cuts back to the man sobbing quietly, still wearing a mime outfit and makeup, some kind of obscure fetish. Diana.avi, 4-minute video in which the cameraman talks to a woman in a room different from the interview room. This room looks like one you'd find in a normal person's house. Exactly where they are is never specified, as Diana only talks about her violin playing. She obviously plays her violin, but she keeps getting distracted by something. I didn't notice this until someone on the image board pointed it out, but if you look at the mirror in the background, you can see a fat man in a chicken mask masturbating. Jessica.avi, another 4-minute cameraman video. This time he's outside a house, talking to another young woman. They talk about canoe rides. The camera then zooms out to reveal the city streets behind them occasionally. The strange thing is, no one so far has been able to identify where the street is. Guesses have ranged from everywhere from Europe to Australia to the Philippines, but there's yet to be a match for the street shown in the video. Tonguetied.avi, 10-minute video. The first 5 minutes consists of an elderly woman making out with a mannequin. The video cuts out like it did in Jimbo.avi halfway through, and the scene is now a group of mannequins huddled together in a circle around the camera. The lights have been dimmed and the elderly woman is nowhere to be seen. From this point on, there is no sound. Stumps.avi, a 5-minute video where a man with no legs is attempting to breakdance on a DDR mat in what looks like the kitchen from peanut.avi, but much dirtier. There's a radio playing music unseen in the background, but it stops at the 4-minute mark when the man collapses on the mat in exhaustion. He breathes heavily and pleads with someone off-screen to let him rest. This off-screen person becomes terrifyingly enraged and yells at him to keep dancing, which he does. You can hear this off-screen person begin to scream as the video ends abruptly. Privacy.avi, the woman from Diana.avi is masturbating on a mattress in the interview room. while the man from thumps.avi walks around on his hands while wearing some kind of goblin mask. The door in this room was always closed in the other videos, but it's now open. In this video, the only lights in the room and in the hallway is dark. Near the end of the video, you can see an animal quickly run through the hallway. And finally, the last video we uncovered, useless.avi. In this 18-minute video, a blonde woman from one of the previous interview videos is tied down to a mattress in the interview room. She attempts to scream, but her mouth is taped over. After 7 minutes, a man in a black suit and mask opens the door, but he does not enter. He holds the door open for the animal that was running in the hall in the previous video. It's revealed to be an adult chimpanzee, its hair shaved and its entire body painted red. When the chimp enters the room, the masked man closes the door behind him. The chimpanzee sniffs the air for a moment. It may have been blind, and notices a woman tied to the mattress. It goes into a frenzy and begins to maul her. The assault goes on for a grueling 7 minutes until the woman finally dies. The chimp eats the flesh from her corpse for 4 minutes as the video ends. The thread exploded with activity after the video was uncovered, and people discussed it long into the night. When I came back to the image board the next day, I found the thread was deleted. I tried to start another one, and they banned me. I tried emailing the guy who sent me the chain letter with the site's URL. Sent him 5 messages and never got a response. I have tried to discuss this website on various places, and I got banned frequently. The site itself was also deleted about 3 days after useless.avi was uncovered, likely because someone contacted the authorities about it. The only proof that normal porn for normalpeople.com ever existed was a few screen caps people took, and a few videos from the site that people saved and uploaded on torrents. The most popular of which being useless.avi, which found its way onto a few gore sites. No matter where you upload them to, all the videos from normal porn for normalpeople.com get deleted after a while. On July 18th, 2020, NASA launched a new vessel. 6 astronauts boarded Goliath 1 and set off to prepare for the first human colony on the moon. The preparations were expected to take a year, but the vessels carried 6 months of additional food past the expectation in case of emergency. Radio communication was possible only on the side of the moon facing the Earth. The astronauts were told to stay in this area to maintain radio contact. The astronauts had landed on the eastern border of the Serenitatis. This lunar mare was largely covered in basalt and held few craters, making it perfect for colonization. The goal of the astronauts was simple: map the area for colonization and blueprint the construction of buildings. The only real danger on the moon was meteors striking it. As the moon was devoid of any atmosphere, an electronic journal of the day's events was to be sent back to NASA along with any interesting photos or videos. Although it was to be seen if anything exciting could happen. It was a moon after all. The first few months of journals were fairly normal. The astronauts were right on schedule with the predicted progress. They wasted no time to blueprint the area. Everything in a normal town was to be in the future town. A grocery store, a school, a hospital, among other things. Of course, these supplies would need to be sent by other vessels. It wasn't their mission to build anything. Then, on the 17th of September that year, the daily report had not come. It was speculated that it was forgotten, but didn't come the next day either. Radio communication was not successful with the astronauts, and was only met with static. The radio tower was seen as working perfectly. It seemed that the astronauts were simply not within range of it. Several missing videos were later recovered from the site. The following is a description of each video. The astronauts were told to label their videos by date, using numbers following the date if more than one video was recorded that day. The first video was labeled appropriately as September 16, 2020, It was around 10 minutes long and is mostly spent examining small craters near the border of the mare. Near the end of the video, the astronaut talks about hearing scratching noises from the crater, but this wasn't audible. The journal sent to NASA for the 16th of September did not mention this noise. The second video is also labeled appropriately as September 17th, 2020. This video was also focused on craters, specifically the nearby Bessel crater. This is an exceptionally large crater, over 9 miles across and a mile deep. The plan was to eventually build a bridge across the crater. This video is roughly the same length of the previous video. The astronauts begin to make notes of the crater when the scratching sound is heard again. This time, however, it is quite audible and appears to be coming from the basin of the crater. The sound becomes so loud it begins to irritate the astronauts. One of the men looks down over the edge to find the source of the sound. A force unseen by the camera suddenly pulls the astronaut into the crater. His screams are heard briefly before the camera is cut short. The third and final video, labeled code 7700 please help. The date is unknown, but it can be assumed it is probably the next day. It begins with an astronaut in an oxygen tent talking to the camera. He explains in a calm voice that he has been unable to contact the radio. He also explains about how 2 of the astronauts have been horribly slaughtered. At this point, tears start to roll down his face, but he continues a calm tone. The scratching noise from the previous videos is heard suddenly and sharply. The camera is knocked to an adjacent wall of the tent, and we listen to the astronaut pleading, followed by a heavy thump. The man continues to plead and cry for help, stating that he can't breathe. The camera is completely turned away from the man, so it is not seen what is attacking him. We see blood begin to splatter the adjacent wall. The man continues to scream for help and is now completely bawling. Blood splatters against the wall for a second time, against the wall alongside the sound of bones snapping and flesh being torn from them. His pleas for help suddenly stop and are just reduced to insane screaming and crying. As blood splatters against the wall again, a bit of brown liquid mixes in with a bright red liquid. The tearing sound has since been replaced with that of squishing and sloshing. The only sound the man makes now is a quiet death rattle. Suddenly the man goes silent and several of his organs are tossed near the direction of the wall. Coincidentally, the night of September 18th was a red moon. None of the bodies of the astronauts from Goliath 1 were ever fully recovered. Colonization of the moon has been postponed until further notice. The team sent to investigate the radio communication problems the astronauts were having refused to talk to the public. Of the 4-man repair team, 2 have committed suicide since returning to Earth. While the 3 videos were recovered, a photograph was also recovered. It is still unknown as to what the photograph is.
I first met in person with Mary E. in the summer of 2007. I had arranged with her husband of 15 years, Terrence, to see her for an interview. Mary had initially agreed, since I was not a newsman but rather an amateur writer gathering information for a few early college assignments, and, if all went according to plan, some pieces of fiction. We scheduled the interview for a particular weekend when I was in Chicago on unrelated business. At the last moment, Mary changed her mind and locked herself in the couple's bedroom, refusing to meet with me. For half an hour I sat with Terrence as we camped outside the bedroom door. I listening and taking notes while he attempted fruitlessly to calm his wife. The things Mary said made little sense but fit with the pattern I was expecting. Though I could not see her, I could tell from her voice that she was crying, and more often than not, her objections to speaking with me centered around an incoherent diatribe on her dreams, her nightmares. Terrence apologized profusely when we ceased the exercise. I did my best to take it in stride. Recall that I wasn't a reporter in search of a story. but merely a curious young man in search of information. Besides, I thought at the time I could perhaps find another similar case if I put my mind and resources to it. Mary E. was the systems operator for a small Chicago-based bulletin board system in 1992 when she first encountered smile.jpg and her life changed forever. She and Terrence had been married for only 5 months. Mary was one of an estimated 400 people who saw the image when it was posted as a hyperlink on the BBS. Though she's the only one who has spoken openly about the experience, the rest have remained anonymous or are perhaps dead. In 2005, when I was only in the 10th grade, smile.jpg was first brought to my attention by my burgeoning interest in web-based phenomena. Mary was the most often cited victim of what is sometimes referred to as smile.dog. The being smile.jpg is reputed to display. What caught my interest, other than the obvious macabre elements of the cyber legend and my proclivity towards such things, was the sheer lack of information, usually to the point that people don't believe it even existed other than as a rumor or a hoax. It is unique because though the entire phenomena centers on a picture file, that the file is nowhere to be found on the internet. Certainly many photo-manipulated simulacra litter the web, showing up with most frequency on sites such as the image board 4chan, particularly the X-Focus Paranormal subboard. It is suspected these are fakes because they do not have the effect the true smile.jpg is believed to have, namely sudden onset temporal lobe epilepsy and acute anxiety. This purported reaction in the viewer is one of the reasons the phantom-like smile.jpg is regarded with such disdain, since it is patently absurd, though depending on whom you ask, the reluctance to acknowledge smile.jpg's existence might be just as much out of fear as it is out of disbelief. Neither smile.jpg nor smile.dog is mentioned anywhere on Wikipedia, though the website features articles on such other, perhaps more scandalous shock sites as hello.jpg or 2 Girls 1 Cup. Any attempt to create a page pertaining to smile.jpg is summarily deleted by any of the encyclopedia's many admins. Encounters with smile.jpg are the stuff of internet legend. Mary E.'s story is not unique. There are unverified rumors of smile.jpg showing up in the early days of Usenet, and even one persistent tale that in 2002 a hacker flooded the forums of humor and satire website Something Awful with a deluge of smile.dog pictures, rendering almost half the forum's users at the time epileptic. It is also said that in the mid to late 90s that smile.jpg circulated on Usenet and as an attachment of a chain email with the subject line "Smile, God loves you." Yet despite the huge exposure these stunts would generate, there are very few people who admit to having experienced any of them, and no trace of the file or any link has ever been discovered. Those who claim to have seen smile.jpg often weakly joke that they were far too busy to save a copy of the picture to their hard drive. However, all alleged victims offer the same description of the photo. A dog-like creature, usually described as appearing similar to a Siberian husky, illuminated by the flash of the camera, sits in a dim room. The only background detail that is visible being a human hand extending from the darkness near the left side of the frame. The hand is empty, but is usually described as beckoning. Of course, most attention is given to the dog or dog creature, as some victims are more certain than others about what they claim to have seen. The muzzle of the beast is reputedly split in a wide grin, revealing 2 rows of very white, very straight, very sharp, very human-looking teeth. This, of course, is not a description given immediately after viewing the picture, but rather a recollection of the victims who have claimed to have seen the picture endlessly repeated in their mind's eye during the time they are, in reality, having epileptic fits. These fits are reported to continue indeterminably, often while the victims sleep, resulting in very vivid and disturbing nightmares. These may be treated with medication, though in some senses it is more effective than others. Mary E., I assumed, was not on effective medication. That is why after my visit to her apartment in 2007, I sent out feelers to several folklore and urban legend-oriented news groups, websites, and mailing lists, hoping to find the name of a supposed victim of Smile.jpg who felt more interested in talking about his experiences. For a time, nothing happened, and at length, I forgot completely about my pursuits, since I had begun my freshman year of college and was quite busy. Mary contacted me via email, however, near the beginning of March 2008. Dear Mr. L., I'm incredibly sorry about my behavior last summer when you came to interview me. I hope you understand that it was no fault of yours, but rather my own problems that led me to act out as I did. I realize that I could have handled the situation more decorously, however, I hope you will forgive me. At the time, I was afraid. You see, for 15 years, I had been haunted by Smile.jpg. Smile.dog comes to me in my sleep every night. I know that sounds silly, but it's true. There's an ineffable quality about my dreams, my nightmares, that makes them completely unlike any real dreams I've ever had. I do not move and I do not speak. I simply look ahead, and the only thing ahead of me is a scene from that horrible picture. I see the beckoning hand, and I see Smile.dog. It talks to me. It's not a dog, of course, though I'm not quite sure what it really is. It tells me it will leave me alone if I only do what it asks. All I must do, it says, is spread the word. That is how it phrases its demands, and I know exactly what it means. It wants me to show it to someone else, and I could. The week after my incident, I received in the mail a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was only a 3.5-inch floppy diskette. Without having to check, I knew precisely what was on it. I thought for a long time about my options. I could show it to a stranger, a coworker. I could even show it to Terrence, as much as the idea disgusted me. And what would happen then? Well, if Smile.dog kept its word, I could sleep. Yet if it lied, what would I do? And who was to say something worse would not come for me, if I did as the creature asked? So I did nothing for 15 years. Though I kept the diskette hidden amongst my things, every night for 15 years Smile.dog has come to me in my sleep and demanded that I spread the word. For 15 years I have stood strong, though there have been hard times. Many of my fellow victims on the BBS board where I first encountered Smile.jpg stopped posting. I heard some of them committed suicide. Others remained completely silent, simply disappearing off the face of the web. They're the ones I worry about the most. I sincerely hope you will forgive me, Mr. L., but last summer, when you contacted me and my husband about an interview, I was near the breaking point. I decided I was going to give you the floppy diskette. I did not care if Smile.dog was lying or not. I wanted it to end. You were a stranger, someone I had no connection with, and I thought I would not feel sorrow when you took the diskette as part of your research and sealed your fate. Before you arrived, I realized what I was doing. I was plotting to ruin your life. I could not stand the thought, and in fact, I still cannot. I'm ashamed, Mr. L., and I hope that this warning will dissuade you from any further investigation of Smile.jpg. You may in time encounter someone who is, if not weaker than I, then wholly more depraved, someone who will not hesitate to follow Smile.dog's orders. Stop while you're still whole. Sincerely, Mary E. Terrence contacted me later that month with news that his wife had killed herself. While cleaning up various things she'd left behind, closing email accounts and the like, he happened upon the above message. He was a man in shambles. He wept as he told me to listen to his wife's advice. He found the diskette, he revealed, and burned it till it was nothing but a stinking pile of blackened plastic. The part that most disturbed him, however, was how the diskette had hissed as it melted, like it was some sort of animal, he said. I will admit that I was a little uncertain about how to respond to this. At first I thought perhaps it was a joke, with the couple belatedly playing with the situation in order to get a rise out of me. A quick check of several Chicago newspaper online obituaries, however, proved that Mary E. was indeed dead. There was, of course, no mention of suicide in the article. I decided that, for a time at least, I would not further pursue the subject of smile.jpg, especially since I had finals coming up at the end of May. But the world has odd ways of testing us. Almost a full year after I'd returned from a disastrous interview with Mary E., I received another email. Hello. I found your email address through a mailing list. Your profile said you're interested in Smile Dog. I've saw it. It's not as bad as everyone says. I've sent it to you here. Just spreading the word. The final line chilled me to the bone. According to my email client, there was one file attachment called naturally smile.jpg. I considered downloading it for some time. It was most likely a fake, I imagined. I was never wholly convinced of smile.jpg's peculiar powers. Mary E.'s account had shaken me, yes, but she was probably mentally unbalanced anyway. After all, how could a simple image do what smile.jpg was said to accomplish? What sort of creature was it that could break one's mind with only the power of the eye? And if such things were patently absurd, then why did the legend exist at all? If I downloaded the image, if I looked at it, and if Mary turned out to be correct, if smile.dog came to me in my dreams demanding I spread the word, what would I do? Would I live my life as Mary had, fighting against the urge to give in until I died? Or would I simply spread the word, eager to be put to rest? And if I chose the latter route, how could I do it? Whom would I burden in turn? If I went through with my earlier intention to write a short article about smile.jpg, I decided I could attach it as evidence, and anyone who read the article, anyone who took interest, would be affected. And even assuming the smile.jpg attached to the email was genuine, would I be capricious enough to save myself in that manner? Could I spread the word? Yes. Yes, I could. My sister had a teddy bear, a scary teddy bear. I don't know why, but it creeped me out. It was just so disturbing to me. The thing had eyes that looked so real. It was as if it was made from a real bear, and its face was just blank and unsettling. I first started to get weird feelings about the bear when my sister first got it. She was only a baby at the time, and I was about 4. We had a dog, you see, and he had a habit of eating things, so my mother had to put it up on a small cabinet in the corner of the hallway upstairs. Every time I went up those stairs, I saw that creepy bear suddenly glare around the corner at me, as if it was watching me. This wasn't the weird part. It started to get really weird about 5 years later, at the age of 6 or 7. My sister had lost interest in the bear, so my mother just threw it in the old toy cupboard. The only problem was the cupboard was in my room. When I was 9, old enough to stay on my own and go to bed without any assistance, I would get into bed every night and turn my lamp off. This is when it got scary. As I was getting some sleep, I suddenly remembered Mom putting that teddy in the cupboard. I slowly turned to look over across my room to see it.
through the glass. My heart suddenly stopped as I thought about the horrors the plush had caused me. But at that age of 9, I wanted to grow up and lose my fears, so I just shook it off and put my head on the pillow. When I got up to pull my sheets on a bit further, I noticed something that would scar me for life. There sat, at the end of my bedroom, the teddy. My heart started to beat normally again. I sat there staring at it for about a minute. When I needed to yawn, I closed my eyes. I opened them to see the teddy sitting closer to my bed. At this point, I was really freaked out. I started to move back to the wall and look around to see if there was any sign that anyone had come in. When I looked back to see the teddy on the end of my bed, I was so startled that I almost fainted from fear. When I blinked, it had gone. I looked around. To my relief, I saw no sign of it. I sat my head back down on my pillow, hoping for some sleep. Then I opened my eyes. It was above my head, staring straight down. I screamed as it lunged down at me. I will never see a bear the same way again. A few years later, after years of horror, I burned it. I sat in enjoyment as a bear was turned to smoking ashes in my fireplace. I have lived my teenage life through adolescence. The only thing I could remember that was in any way similar to my bad experience was when I watched Trainspotting. That fucking baby scene shocked me so bad, but other than that, all was well. When I turned 19, I was about to move into my new home. I had been given the keys to the house and was ready to set up my furniture. After a few hours of carrying, I carried the final box from the removal truck into the front door and shut the door behind me. I turned to go into the kitchen and put it on the table. I opened it to see a cabinet. I took it out and walked into my new living room and placed it in the corner. Stared at it, thought to myself, I don't remember packing this cabinet.
I didn't really care that much, as I had just moved into my new home.
I walked back into the kitchen to grab my television and brought it into the living room. When I saw it, the teddy just sat there, staring at me.
In June 1972, a woman appeared in Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, California, in nothing but a white, blood-covered gown. Now this in itself should not be too surprising, as people often have accidents nearby and come to the nearest hospital for medical attention. But there were two things that caused people who saw her to vomit and flee in terror. The first being that she wasn't exactly human. She resembled something close to a mannequin, but had the dexterity and fluidity of a normal human being. Her face was as flawless as a mannequin's, devoid of eyebrows and smeared in makeup. There was a kitten clamped in her jaws so unnaturally tight that no teeth could be seen, and the blood was still squirting all over her gown and onto the floor. She then pulled it out of her mouth, tossed it aside, and collapsed. From the moment she stepped through the entrance to when she was taken to a hospital room and cleaned up before being prepped for sedation, she was completely calm, expressionless, and motionless. The doctors thought it best to restrain her until the authorities could arrive, and she did not protest. They were unable to get any kind of response from her, and most staff members felt too uncomfortable to look directly at her for more than a few seconds. But the second the staff tried to sedate her, she fought back with extreme force. 2 members of staff had to hold her down as her body rose up on the bed with the same blank expression. She turned her emotionless eyes to the male doctor and did something unusual. She smiled. As she did, the female doctor screamed and let go out of shock. In the woman's mouth were not human teeth, but long, sharp spikes, too long for her mouth to close fully without causing any damage. The male doctor stared back at her for a moment before asking, "What in the hell are you?" She cracked her neck down to her shoulder to observe him, still smiling. There was a long pause. The security had been alerted and could be heard coming down the hallway. As she heard them approach, she darted forward, sinking her teeth into the front of his throat, ripping out his jugular and letting him fall to the floor, gasping for air as he choked on his own blood. She stood up and leaned over him, her face coming dangerously close to his as the life faded from his eyes. She leaned closer and whispered in his ear, "I am God." The doctor's eyes filled with fear as he watched her calmly walk away to greet the security men. His last ever sight would be watching her feast on them, one by one. The female doctor who survived the incident named her the Expressionless. There was never a sighting of her again. A few years ago, a mother and a father decided they needed a break, so they wanted to head out for a night on the town. They called their most trusted babysitter. When the babysitter arrived, the two children were already fast asleep in bed, so the babysitter just got to sit around and make sure everything was okay with the children. Later that night, the babysitter got bored and went to watch TV. But she couldn't watch it downstairs because they did not have cable downstairs. The parents didn't want their children watching too much garbage, so she called them and asked them if she could watch cable in the parents' room. Of course, the parents said it was okay, but the babysitter had one final request. She asked if she could cover up the angel statue outside the bedroom window with a blanket or cloth because it made her nervous. The phone line was silent for a moment, and the father who was talking to the babysitter at the time said, "Take the children and get out of the house. We'll call the police. We don't own an angel statue." The police found both the children and the babysitter slumped in pools of their own blood within 3 minutes of the call. No statue was found. During the summer of 1983, a quiet town near Minneapolis, Minnesota, the charred body of a woman was found inside the kitchen stove of a small farmhouse. A video camera was also found in the kitchen, standing on the tripod, pointing at the oven. No tape was inside the camera at the time. Although the scene was originally labeled as a homicide by police, an unmarked VHS tape was later discovered at the bottom of the farm's well, which had apparently dried up earlier that year. Despite its worn condition and the fact that it contained no audio, police were still able to view the contents of the tape. It depicted a woman recording herself in front of a video camera, seemingly using the same camera that the police found in the kitchen. After positioning the camera to include both her and her kitchen stove in its view, she turned on the oven, opened the door, crawled inside, and then closed the door behind her. After 8 minutes into the video, the oven could be seen shaking violently. At this point, thick black smoke emanated from it. For the remaining 45 minutes of the video, until the batteries in the camera died, it remained in its stationary position. To avoid disturbing the local community, the police never released any information about the tape or even the fact that it was found. Police were also not able to determine who put the tape in the well, or why the height and the stature of the woman in the video did not come close to matching the body that they found in the oven. It's funny how things work. We have giant metal vehicles that fly through the air. We have HD video that you can carry in your pocket. We have music that can be accessed anytime from devices that use touchscreens. But when something like this happens, something so stupid, something so simple, there's nothing to be done. Nothing that can be done even with our advances. I woke up 3 weeks ago in this place. It's a medium-sized room with concrete walls, floor and ceiling. In spots, the concrete is stained and cracked. A single light bulb hangs from the ceiling and sometimes it flickers. It's not a very powerful bulb, but enough to see by. I woke up next to a woman. I didn't recognize her, but that didn't matter. I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know how I'd gotten here. There didn't seem to be any doors or windows or openings of any kind. Just a concrete box with me and a sleeping woman in it. I woke her up after a few moments of dazed confusion. She didn't scream, which was my worry, and instead asked questions calmly. "Where are we?" she asked. "I don't know." "How did I get here?" "I don't know." "Who are you?" I smiled. Finally, a question I could answer. "I'm Tom," I said. "Tom Green. I woke up here just a minute ago, and I was hoping you'd have an idea about it. But since you don't, well, we may as well get acquainted. You know my name. What's yours?" I asked. I stuck out my hand. She shook my hand. "I'm Melissa," she replied. "Melissa Dobbs. Last I remember I was..." She froze and creased her eyebrows. "Did you hear that?" I listened but didn't hear anything. I shook my head. "What was it?" I asked. It sounded like, I don't know, a thump? We sat in silence for a few minutes listening for another noise. There was nothing but silence as long as we sat there. After so long, I just shook my head. "I don't think there's anything there, Melissa," I said. "But if you did hear a sound, that means we're close to the surface." "Surface?" she repeated. "What do you mean, surface?" "Well, I figured we're probably underground. Where else would somebody keep a concrete box? Another thing I'm wondering is how they even got us in here. It all seems like a dream, you know?" I sighed and leaned my back against the wall. This couldn't be happening. Not really. "I know what you mean," Melissa said. "It just doesn't seem real. This doesn't just happen. This can't just happen. This time I heard the noise too. It was like a thump, but a squishy thump, like if you hit an animal with a heavy object. Images of bleeding animals flashed in my mind. Pictures of infants being hit with hammers and baseball bats. I almost jumped. I was so surprised. Why would I think that? That wasn't normal. None of this was normal. This place and that sound and these thoughts. None of this was right. "Did you..." "Yeah, I heard it," I interrupted Melissa. I started to ask if she saw things, but she would think I was crazy. Being here was making me a little stressed, sure, but crazy? No. No, and I wouldn't let her think that. Melissa and I spent the rest of the day discussing the situation and listening for the noises. It seems like they came at regular intervals, once every 10 minutes or so. I thought maybe we were near an automatic machine. Sometimes the sounds came, I would have the flashes of terrible things. It was so disgusting and wrong, but it happened. I couldn't help it. I wondered if Melissa had the flashes, but I didn't dare ask her. If my only companion thought I was crazy, well, I didn't think it would end well. We had thought it was some sort of hostage taking at first. We thought we had been taken captive by criminals. That's what we decided. It was a normal assumption about 30 thumps into the day, though our thoughts changed. We were hungry. If the thumps really were coming every 10 minutes, then 30 thumps meant we'd been awake for 5 hours. I could hear my stomach growling, and once I even heard Melissa's. We were thirsty more, though. My throat was sore and dry, but we had no water or food. We were talking about what we'd do when we got out of this box, when it happened. The interviews and books and maybe even movies that would come. We could both get rich off this. We tried to remain positive like that. Suddenly, everything went black. It felt like only a second, and I didn't realize my eyes had closed until I opened them. Melissa and I woke up at the same time. We were confused. Somehow we'd blacked out at the same time, woken up at the same time, and food? Melissa whispered. There's food and water. She was staring into a corner of the room, where before there'd been nothing, but now there were 2 trays with food and water on them. My stomach rumbled, and I didn't care where they'd come from, or how we'd blacked out. Let's eat, I said, grabbing our trays. We can talk about it in a few thumps. Melissa actually laughed. Funny how the way we measure time can change just like that, she said, grabbing her food. But I guess it's just as good as minutes or hours. The food was good. Warm steak and potatoes, a scoop of ice cream for dessert, a liter bottle of water to drink. The steak was pre-cut for us, so no knives. The forks we were given were dull, very dull. No way we could hurt anyone with them. Not that we would be able to regardless, since it seemed they could induce loss of consciousness whenever they wanted to. I got the feeling that once we were done eating, we'd just black out again, and the forks and trays would be gone. We ate in silence, and my guess was confirmed. We lost our trays and our forks, and again, we were just in an empty concrete box. We never actually talked about it. We just kept busy talking about other things. After another 50 or so thumps, we went to sleep. It was hard at first to sleep with the thumps, but as with anything, you grow accustomed to it. You grow accustomed to the thumps and the flashes and the blackouts, just as people grow accustomed to planes and phones and iPods. This is adaptation. This is evolution. I don't know how long we slept, but every day there seemed to be less time in between each thump. Each day, though, the food seemed to get a little better. The first day's food was good, but it seemed bland. Each day the food tasted better, as if a reward for losing time between the thumps. This is conditioning. By day 10, there was barely any time between the thumps. The food was delicious. We couldn't get enough. Melissa and I got along well enough. We were becoming pretty big friends, and at around day 5 we started having sex. We didn't love each other, but we were both adults. We both wanted something to keep us busy and entertained. Why not sex? Day 12, though, things took a turn. They went bad. We were eagerly awaiting lunch. We were ready for the blackout, ready to delight in the delicious food we'd come to expect. We weren't thinking about escape. We weren't thinking about anything. Thumps, flashes, food. Thumps, flashes, food. The flashes had gotten worse, so much worse. The thumps came so fast now, the flashes were in my head all the time. Babies, flayed open and dead. Dogs, limbs severed and laying in pools of blood. Cats, with their eyes pulled out and their organs ripped from their abdomens. All just animals. Dead animals. Their lives had been so important before. Now useless. Now nothing. Now just a heap of bloody regret. This is my future. This is the death of all. Thump. Darkness. When I awoke, I didn't smell food like I used to. Melissa was already awake, crying. What's the matter? I asked her. Why are you awake? I didn't fall asleep this time, she whispered. They came in. They came in straight through the wall. They were so hideous. They... She started to sob. Calm down, Melissa, I said. I went to her and I put my arm around her. She latched onto me weakly. Tell me what happened. They don't have mouths, Tom, she cried. They're not human. But the thumps come from their heads. We don't hear them with our ears, Tom. I never noticed this before. But we hear them in our heads. Do you understand? They didn't bring food. They said they'll keep bringing food from now on, but not today. They tried to tell me something else, but they had to stop thumping to talk to me. And once the thumping was gone, I didn't hear them. I didn't want to. I begged them to stop, to bring it back. They stopped talking, and they left. This is necessary. I held Melissa until she stopped crying and fell asleep. I thought about the changes we had now. I was trying to comfort her, but all I could think about was the flashes had stopped. I hadn't realized it until that moment because I was so used to the flashes accompanying the thumps that I had given myself flashes. But they weren't coming anymore, not really. Something had changed since mealtime, and it made me almost uncomfortable. I could understand Melissa panicking when the thumping stopped now, though I didn't think I would have freaked out that badly. Melissa was still crying. "I'm sorry, Tom," she mumbled, pushing her face into my chest. I could feel her tears seeping through my shirt. "I should have been able to talk to them, but the thumps, it's so strange, they're gone. I'm used to them now." I understood perfectly. We spent the rest of the day solemnly talking, not about what we would do when we got out, but how we could possibly get out. Things weren't normal. The thought that we might get out was beyond us now. We accepted that. We could live like this, at least for a while. Then one day, maybe in a month or a year, we might use our forks and dig into our wrists. Do they have thumps in heaven or hell or whatever lies beyond? We got food the next day. The thumps continued and the flashes remained silent. The food was better and life was good again. Melissa, though, she was shaken. Maybe it was seeing our captors that had her so on edge. Maybe they put something in her head. The flashes, I thought. Is it possible they left my head and went to hers? Crazy. But crazier things had happened here. Every day, Melissa got more nervous, more agitated. I couldn't understand. I tried to talk to her about it, but she wouldn't answer my questions. She just looked at me and shook her head. "Nothing's wrong," she would say. "I'm just tired." This is denial. It happened on day 20. We fell asleep. We woke up and ate our food. We went about things as usual. I didn't know. If I had, I would have done something. Suffering alone is 1,000 times worse than suffering with a friend. I was finishing my dessert, and Melissa did it quick as lightning. She stabbed herself hard in one wrist, then the other. Then she shoved it in her mouth. She jammed it in her throat, pulling and pushing and grinding it in there, trying desperately to kill herself, to end it. One wrist was bright red, but it hadn't drawn blood. The other she stabbed harder, much harder, and it had holes in it. The holes were pretty deep, leaking, pouring blood. Blood was trickling out of her mouth, and when I throw my food down and reach out to stop her, she kicked me in the chest. I fell against the wall, and she kept stabbing, cutting, and choking with the fork. I didn't realize I was screaming. The thumps had joined together by this point, making constant noise, and it was hard to hear over. Eventually she slowed and tried to get the fork down her throat. She gagged and choked and retched, but it didn't come out. I got to her and pushed her arms away and reached in, but it was far down at this point. Too far. My only companion. Dying. She died quickly. Between the blood and the choking, I don't know what killed her. I didn't care. I cried the rest of the day. I felt like doing the same thing. I thought maybe I would. The next day, maybe I would join her again. At least I wouldn't be alone. The next day, however, didn't work out like that. I waited and waited. Eventually the blackout came. I was eager to kill myself after a delightful meal. I just hope I didn't mess it up. I'd hate to be half dead on the floor, pissing and shitting myself alone for who knows how long. Fortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to mess it up. I woke up outside. It was dark. This wasn't right. "No," I whispered. No one was in sight, but I could see the lights of a town in the distance. I was out. I'd made it out of my concrete prison. No. This is panic. This is change. I'm not ready for this. Thumps were gone, but things had changed. Adaptation. Conditioning. Thumps were gone. The flashes were back. Evolution. I wasn't used to the silence. It was driving me mad. The flashes didn't help either. I knew what would make the flashes go away, though. The thumps. They would keep the flashes at bay. Make me comfortable again. That was all I needed. And they'd been teaching me how to make the thumps. They'd been teaching me since day one. I just had to... I grimaced, not wanting to think about it. But I needed the thumps. What did I have to lose, anyway? My only companion was gone. I stood and headed for the town in the distance. Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money, and since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call, and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I would have to do is stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head, to read my brain activity. And while I was there, I would visualize a double of myself. They called it my tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would be paid. And the next day I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my head and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again, and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around, or try to interact with him, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it for the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I'd done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted, but by the 4th day, I could manage to keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The 2nd week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could still keep the tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, and what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, and guttural voices speaking some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations, or play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling, or breakdancing, or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while, and then it got a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I'd said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was a green one. I thought about it for a second and realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. You're using the thought form to access your subconscious, they explained. You knew on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself. What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books I'd read once, years before, or things I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it almost seemed odd to not see him. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually I started doing it almost all the time, It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with my friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak aloud to him, so I was able to carry out conversations with him, and no one was the wiser. I know that sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I'd forgotten, he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of the minutiae of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date I brought him along on was going badly, but he pointed out how she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other subtle clues I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and let's just say that date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I'd stop visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions. Why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did. Or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded at my door until I answered it and came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered me when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick," he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him, and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my tulpa grew furious. "Hit him," it said, and before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious than I've ever been, and I was not merciful, and I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs. And that was when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were there a few minutes later, but I told them he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they let me off with a warning. My tulpa was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and knew my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained all this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that you're imagining," one told me. My double stood beside him and nodded his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious around my tulpa, and it seemed that he was changing. He looked taller and more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over, I decided. If he was out of control, I'd put him down. I was so used to him at this point that visualizing him was an automatic process, so I started my damnedest not to visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, his teeth more pointed. He hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months seemed to accompany him everywhere. Even when I was home, I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him. And there he'd be, and the howling noise with him. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my tulpa. I was wrong. After my shift one day, About 5.5 months in, two impressive men grabbed and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into my body. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped into the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me, cackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted. His eyes were sunken in their sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted and his fingernails were like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed in my restraints as best as I could, but could hardly move at all. They're pumping you full of the good shit, I think. How's the mind? All fuzzy? He leaned in closer and closer as he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but I couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something, or force-feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then he cut her throat, and her blood showered me. It was so real that I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled invectives, demanded answers. They never spoke to me. They may have talked to my tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure. I was so doped and confused that it may have just been more delusion. But I remember them talking to him. I grew convinced that he was the real one, and I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought at times, mocked me at others. Another thing that I pray was a delusion. He could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me if he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once he grabbed me by my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed my forearm with one of his talons. I still have a scar. Most days I convinced myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days. Then one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A querulous look crossed his face and reached out and touched my head like my mother used to when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment and then smiled. All thoughts are creative, he told me. Then he walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained, shaking. I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home eventually. I don't understand how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it, took a long shower, and slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night, and nobody came the next day, or the one after that. It was over. I spent a week locked in that room, but it felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were aliases. Even the money I received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself. It works sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister's the latest victim in a spree of killings, the police say. The perpetrator mugs his victims, then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon. It was a lovely service, as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff. That sounds like feedback and shrieking and a modem dialing up. I hear it still, a little louder. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last 5 for about a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to the test, and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversation took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirror portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity, with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped, so did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives. They were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response: "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately the voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened, and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them in life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subject's thighs and chest stuffed in the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arms of one doctor. When his heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he bled out, to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word more over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility, the 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back in his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him to prepare him for surgery. He fought furiously against the restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through the 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood was triple the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on him. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to the surgery, and he had only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested reluctantly they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should not be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple: keep cutting. The other two test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had been injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: "I must remain awake." All three subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all three stopped struggling the moment it was let slip. They were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point all three were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might, first left, then right, then left again, for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned his gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things, not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" The subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, beginning to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out, so nearly free.